Good afternoon and welcome to St. Peter's in Hove. I'm Father Alexander and I'm here to talk about um, chapters 4, 5, and 6 of Jeremiah. Um, Jeremiah's always got a bit of a bad reputation. We have this English word Jeremiad, which means a long diatribe by a very gloomy person. Yes, and this, I think, is you could understand why 4, 5, and 6 is effectively a Jeremiad. He's talking about the invasion coming from the north, the invasion of the Assyrians or the Babylonians or whoever they are. And terrible indeed is this invasion going to be. Now, I've never lived through a war. All the wars that have happened in my lifetime have taken place far away. I do remember as a little boy asking my parents about the war, and they were actually not in Britain at the time, but I did have some relations who were in Britain at the time. And I'd ask them about air raids and so on and so forth. Some of them were very lucky, they had no air raids at all. Some of them had a great deal. One of my uncles actually fought in the war. One of my great uncles, one of my cousins, actually fought in the First World War. But war is at one remove from us. It's not really a thing. We're all sitting at home quite happily. None of us are thinking that suddenly a foreign invader is going to sweep in and put us to the sword. We're all quite comfortable. And yet, this is what is going to happen to the people of Judah. I don't know if you saw that film recently that's won all these awards, All Quiet on the Western Front. I couldn't watch it. I thought it was just so awful. The violence, I just found it really not very entertaining at all. And I found it all too much. Again, recently I tried to re-watch Saving Private Ryan. I found that too hard to watch. The Second World War was an equally nasty war, along with the First World War. The First World War had its unique horror. Right now, the war that's going on in Ukraine has an added horror in that it involves civilians who are caught up in this terrible conflict, and many of whom have been killed by the invading Russian forces. Deliberately killed, not just collateral damage. It seems to be a policy of terror. And that happens in many, many wars. The war in Yugoslavia. It also happened in the Second World War. The most horrible thing about the Second World War, I think, the thing that haunts me more than anything else, is those Germans who were living on the Baltic coast and were told to stay at home because nothing was going to happen to them. Then they were told that they were cut off. And those who fled from Kaliningrad, as it now is, Königsberg, across the frozen ice to get away from the Russians. Their terrible, terrible fear, the horror of that evacuation, and those who were left behind and who fell into the hands of the Russians, the horror they endured. I'm not a pacifist. I do believe in the just war theory, but I don't like war. And I'm rather impatient with all these people who go around saying I'm anti-war. Actually, we're all anti-war. War is something we would embark on purely as a last resort. None of us glorify war, and our remembrance of wars, the ceremonies in November on Armistice Day, these are not glorifying war. These are mourning that wars ever had to take place, and they're thanksgiving to Almighty God that the right people won the war, because there's only one thing worse than the Second World War, and that would have been allowing Hitler, or the First World War, allowing the Kaiser to have a victory. Thankfully, we stopped them, but it was at a terrible price. So we don't glorify war, we loathe war, we're against war, but I'm not a pacifist. Announce it in Judah. This is chapter 4, verse 5. Proclaim it in Jerusalem. Say, sound the trumpet in the countryside. Shout the message aloud. Mobilize. Take to the fortified towns. Signpost the way to Zion. Run. Do not delay. For I am bringing disaster from the north, an immense calamity. The lion is up from the thicket. The destroyer of nations is on his way. He has come from his home to reduce your land to desert. Your towns will be in ruins, uninhabited. Now, this is Project Fear. This is actually Project Realism. The invader is going to come. He is going to lay waste your land. You better run to the fortified towns to try and escape that way. Don't stay at home. Run, mobilize. And of course, the trumpet is sounding. And this trumpet comes up again and again in these chapters. The trumpet is the sound of war. The trumpet is like an air raid siren that would have struck fear into the hearts of our ancestors in Britain during the Blitz. It's terror. It is and run. Do not delay. This panic. And well, I think reading this passage, we do get a very strong idea that the poor people caught up in ancient wars um, really did have cause to panic, really were very, very frightened indeed. And it goes on. Here's verse 9. That day, the Lord declares, the king's heart will fail him, the prince's heart will fail them too. The priests will stand aghast, prophets stupefied. This is even more frightening. Not only are you going to have a foreign army coming and laying waste and possibly carrying you all off into slavery or killing you, but the people you trust, the people who administer your land, they are all going to fail in their jobs. The failure of institutions. Now, that is a really frightening thought that one day you'll pick up the phone and you'll phone the government and there won't be a government. Anarchy. And this is what happened in East Prussia and the eastern parts of Germany as the Russian army swept in. The Gauleiters, the administrators, all fled, and you were left defenseless. Even the priests stopped being priests. The prophets stood there stupefied with their mouths open, unable to say a useful word. You were suddenly left alone and undefended. And then let's look at verses 23 and 24, and it gets worse. You think it can't get worse. It gets worse. I looked to the earth, it was a formless waste. To the heavens, their light had gone. I looked to the mountains, they were quaking and the hills rocking to and fro. I looked, there was no one at all. The very birds of earth had all fled. I looked, the fruitful land was a desert, all its towns in ruins, before the Lord, before his burning anger. In other words, not only is the failure of all earthly institutions, nature itself seems to be destroyed. This is a vision of the end of the world. Now, it's an end of the world for the person who's killed by the invading troops. It's the end of Israel by the invading troops sweeping away all human institutions and the priesthood and the prophets. But it seems like it's the end of the world, full stop. It's the end of the cosmos. Maybe there's an earthquake and so on. I looked at the mountains, they were quaking, but you really do feel it's the end of the world. Now, we take a lot for granted, and it's only right we should take things for granted because that means we can carry on with our daily business. We know the world is here. We know the king is in his palace, and the prime minister is in number 10 Downing Street, and parliament is sitting. The pope is on his throne, and the parish priest is in his presbytery, and I don't know, the prophets are all doing the people who work for the dicasteries in the Vatican are all doing what they should be doing. But in Jeremiah, he's saying to us, all these things that you rely on are going to be swept away. Even the firmness of the mountains, as old as the hills, well, the hills are going. Everything that you've taken for granted is about to be destroyed. It's terrifying. Then, of course, it goes on. You think it can't get any worse? Well, it's going to get worse. Look at chapter 6, verse 16, over a few pages. The Lord says this, stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Which was the good way? Take it. So now that everything's been swept away, now I want you to think in the past, the traditions you had, the traditions that worked, the traditions that brought you prosperity and happiness and peace. Why don't you take those? Why don't you go back to those? Why don't you stop being so innovative? Look where it's got you. And you will find rest for yourselves. This is the answer. The answer is to embrace the truth that is staring you in the face, obedience to God and obedience to his ways. But they have said, we will not take it. I have posted lookouts on your behalf. Listen to the sound of the trumpet, but they said, we will not listen. And hear you nations, and no assembly. What is going to happen then? Disaster. In other words, our disaster is so great because even though disaster is overtaking us and all these things, the Jeremiah describes are happening to somebody somewhere in the world. These disasters have overtaken us. Why is it overtaken? Because we would not listen. We would not obey God. We would not accept the things we know work. And you know what I mean. So, for example, faithfulness in marriage is something that works. It's the bedrock of our society. As goes the family, so goes the world. So said St. John Paul II, and he was right. And yet we wouldn't listen. Again, St. John Paul II did say, and many Catholic theologians echoed this quite correctly, that if you don't have respect for life, you won't have respect for anything. You won't have any human rights whatsoever if your fundamental right to life, to being inviolate, is not respected. I think it's Germaine Grisez or John Finnis said, if you take a consequentialist view of morality, the only reason why you and I are alive is because the people around us have not found a really sufficient reason to kill us. And all the time, they need to find a sufficient reason not to kill us. But if they just once find it's a good idea for us to be put to death, then we're finished. Actually, my life is inviolable. Nobody anywhere has the right to put me to death. End of. And if that's my right, it's the right of everybody else. We know this makes sense. We know it makes sense. And we've had terrible warnings from God about what happens when we abandon that. I was once in Krakow, in the former Jewish ghetto, and there was a memorial to something like 32 members of the same family who'd been murdered at Auschwitz. And they recorded their names, they recorded the date when they were taken away to Auschwitz, and then it just said one thing: thou shalt not kill. God has said that to us. Are we listening? Is it complicated? No, it's not complicated. It's really straightforward. Thou shalt not kill. Just don't do it. Which bit of that didn't you understand, you fools? Oh no, we will not take it. Oh no, we will not listen. Well, if you don't listen, then the disaster will overtake us. We need to, if I was Jewish, I'd say we need to go back to the Torah. If I'm Catholic, I'll say we need to go back to the Ten Commandments, which is in the Torah, by the way. So I'm with the Jews on that one. We need to obey the voice of God. And let's finish with 1623, which I thought was an interesting verse. Why did I think that? Look, a people is coming from the lands of the north, from the far ends of the earth. The great nation is rising. They're armed, etc., etc. They're riding horses. Again, a bit like those panzers of Hitler. The horse would be the tank of the day. Yes, we have heard the news. Our hands fall limp. Anguish has gripped us. Pain like that of a woman in labor. Anguish. There's a lot of angst around nowadays. There's a lot of anguish. There's a lot of sorga, care. Let us turn to the Lord and let us listen to his voice. All the best. Bye.